Hello and welcome back around the bonfire. It is a pleasure to welcome you back into the show that is definitely thinking that was a catch because somebody here bet a lot of money on the Bills. I'm joined by Tim as always today, and we do have a special guest as well. Really excited to welcome Drew VanDerploeg from the Home and Away podcast covering Sporting Kansas City joining us today. Drew, we appreciate you doing the away part of Home and Away as we are looking forward to a little bit of a preseason friendly coming up here.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I'm happy to be here and appreciate the invite. And hopefully I can provide a little bit of context as we dive into preseason play.
Cool. So, Drew, I've actually brought you here for one reason. We haven't experienced having to cover MLS preseason while there's NFL football being played in town, and we were hoping you could just walk us through that process a little bit.
I don't have that issue right now, but yeah, and it's a funny one too because Sporting, and we'll get into this when we talk about previewing the match upcoming. Sporting has a dearth of players at this moment on their professional roster, and there is no Chiefs play to distract anyone from the fact that Sporting is going into preseason with a fairly limited roster, and so the fan base is a little anxious at this moment, to be sure, but. Normally we can kind of do all of this under the radar for the next several weeks, and unfortunately that is not the case right now. So yeah, it is a different world.
Wait, so I'm sure you're all just celebrating though the moves the current have made. Never mind then. Maybe not talk about the current right now either.
No, those are there were some choices made. That's for sure.
Decisions were made.
Yeah.
There's a lot of flux in Kansas City at the moment. There's going to be a lot of Bobby Witt Jr. talk this summer, I would imagine. But we'll dive a little bit deeper into Sporting and I suppose maybe some other things Kansas City in a minute here. We do want to start with a little bit of Chicago Fire news. Not too much to report by way of actual things happening in Chicago at the moment as the team just head down to Florida to kick off preseason. We'll start with a departure actually. Kellyn Acosta officially leaving the club via mutual parting of ways. The Fire will use one of their buyouts to eat the cost of his contract, and he now heads to Poland, where unfortunately I don't have Alan today, where he would be able to say this properly, but I'm going to try. He signs with a Pogoni session on an 18-month contract. Not a great stint here for Kellyn, but wish him all the best. A cool career in the context of MLS. He won every major trophy you could possibly win, and now he looks to finally have his European experiment, as it were.
Yeah, and I think that there were hints that this may have been coming. After the loss against Philadelphia ended the Fire season last year, he kind of sought us out in the relatively small bowels of SeatGeek Stadium, and it just like a handshake that I was giving him turned into a hug, and it felt like he was trying to say goodbye to me and a couple other reporters that were there. So I think that he knew some kind of move was in the works. I still think he's got really good soccer left in him, and I really hope that he finds it in Poland. He had wanted to move to Europe throughout his career, probably not exactly on these terms, but sometimes the moves happen ways that you don't necessarily expect them to, and I think it can, really work out and have some great moments ahead for Kellyn.
Noted Sporting Kansas City target right before he signed with Chicago, by the way. In fact, they were pretty deep in negotiations with him prior to him signing in Chicago. So that was I'm surprised, candidly, to see that he didn't have the success that maybe he expected in Chicago. I agree with Tim. I think there is still a player there, but maybe that this is the right refresh for him.
Yeah, well, maybe another beat on that. Kansas City was one of two teams that was, every team that was not LAFC who didn't want to re-sign him were limited with what they could pay him because of still restrictions in the free agency rules.
Right. Tier 2 free agent, I think, something like that. Yeah,
right. And so it was like you could pay 15% more than he was making before, and like that was sort of what teams were capped at. And so teams were not really able to compete on money. They were able to compete on length of contract and other minor stuff. Length isn't minor, but like everything else is just sort of like minor here or there. And the Fire won out, which I think was a major coup at the time. And so there were competitive offers. He was going to make the same money, whether he was in Chicago or somewhere else. And yeah, I really thought he was going to have a rebound year last year with Greg because he's played great soccer under Greg with the national team. He pretty quickly fell out of favor. I can't exactly piece together 100% of what happened other than to say with some injury trouble and stuff, that can sometimes change the way that you're able to play. This is just a theory, and some players are able to adapt on the pitch quicker than others to maybe some restrictions around their game because he's been an athletic, sort of like physical player. And you saw that also with the way that he's willing to get in guys' faces and stuff like that, and kind of bring that kind of energy, which the Fire really, I think, are going to miss without him. And maybe that was it. Maybe it's something else, but he continued to work in training. He was a very popular guy in the locker room, and I think really did a ton, even though he was only named captain a couple of times over the 2 years, to keep the locker room together, especially in 2024 when it's like guys were just like another bad result, looking down at their shoes afterwards, kind of wondering what to do. And just, that was not easy work for Kellyn or anybody else to be thrown into.
Quick question, Tim. I mean, I don't know what the cap situation is for the Fire as a whole. I'm sure you're going to talk about that a little bit when you talk about roster. But, I mean, Acosta, as much as he is a valuable player in a lot of levels, we're talking about borderline max TAM guy, right? So, like, you need significant value out of that type of investment. It's just in a salary cap league, I think that's also some of the calculus.
I think it's 100% part of the calculus, and I know the Fire had tried to find a landing spot for him in the league, and that would have involved, the Fire taking some of that cap hit, and Kellyn be paid the same money, but taking some of the cap hit in the final year of his deal, and sending him on, and they were not able to find any takers at, any number that would have been close to making sense to the Fire. Basically, there were no nibbles, is the way that I'd summarize it. And I think that just says something, right, about like the questions after 2 years of not performing well in different coaches and limited minutes and all of that, and just that one of the challenges of the cap, because I think there's upside with Kellyn, right? And you sign him to a new deal based on how he does in 2026, maybe middle of the year, and you could maybe get a very good player that can stick with you and is a great guy in the locker room for the next, few seasons, but it wasn't to be.
Absolutely. Andrew, I think you said it well there. It comes down to value. And when you have Sergio Orahel playing at arguably a higher, if not equal level, you have Mauricio Pineda playing at a higher, if not equal level, and even a guy like Sam Williams who can make a spot start when you need him to. It's really tough to justify spending almost $2 million on a guy who's just sitting on your bench. And now, look, the other side of the coin, too, when you talk about in-league stuff is like you said, Tim, Kellyn wanted to go to Europe. And if this was that opportunity where, hey, if we're going to eat $1 million of his contract anyway, let's just use the whole buyout and let him do whatever he would like to do. So wishing him all the best. And now we have what? FC Valor. We have Portland Heart of Pines. We have Drew. I don't know how familiar you are with the lore of the Bonfire. We have like 9 other things we support. So now Pagoni Session will be in that crew as well.
Also shout out Alex Monas, who just signed with Connecticut United FC, about to start play in
That's
USL.
another one.
Yeah. Training ground on the river in Bridgeport, Connecticut, across from a train station. So good transit options, and across the street from a Chipotle. So that just kind of sounds like heaven in a lot of ways. But we go on.
Yeah, let's move on to maybe something a little bit more exciting, which is Chicago Fire have officially announced the signing of Puso Dithejane, a U22 initiative signing from TS Galaxy in South Africa. So apparently Greg doesn't just want one, he wants them in pairs. The second South African youngster to join in the last, 30 days or so. He's a converted right back, was playing as a fullback, now moves to more of not a traditional winger, but a winger role, oftentimes kind of playing inverted. 9 goal contributions in just over 1,000 minutes in the Betway Premiership so far this season. I got to tell you, Tim, I don't know how much you've dug into the tape here. This could be something very good. Noticing a lot of great pace, very aggressive, very technical with the ball, and has the ability to finish. And the competition level is different, of course, but I think the interesting thing is looking at this tape, it's a guy who has the things that you can't, that are going to look good regardless of your level of competition, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Look, the Fire really think they've got a guy here. Like they think they've got a good player that can be dynamic going forward. The thing about pairs was intentional. Greg spoke to us a little bit about that, about the desire to have someone that could, help, the other guy, the other South African on the team, in Bekele and Mwazi, adapt and kind of grow into the culture and those things. What is a little bit funny is their native languages are not the same. So there's that. I think that eventually, like, people will settle and find ways to communicate. English is, sort of understood pretty widely in South Africa, and not, we're not sure about spoken. The kind of curious thing about this move, I was a little surprised when I went to training that the team, didn't yet have anyone from South Africa there, and there wasn't an imminent date on their arrival at that point. And that was about a month and a half after Mbowazi was signed. I remember there being something about the news about a special program for South Africans to be able to get to the United States quickly with visas. I'm not 100% sure why Mbowazi wouldn't be eligible for that. I'd have to look into those details.
I can think of one pretty obvious reason why he wouldn't be eligible for that. Listen, we don't need to do that today.
No, but in all seriousness, though, I think the challenging thing, though, with signing Dithejane then is if it's, more than 45 days. And like every player situation is different. And sometimes it is literally just you get someone doing the visa clearance process and like they're not getting through the paperwork at whatever reason. Things can happen, or someone has a name that sounds like a name of someone else that is on a list somewhere, and that causes more background checks and more like it can just be crazy, right? Like then, so there's that. Every case is individual, but I think it does raise a question of how quickly Dithejane will be able to get in and adapt, because there is a realistic situation where he will miss all of the preseason. I mean, barring a absolute late second, sort of like almost quasi miracle here, like unless Mbowazi's on a plane as we're recording for South Florida, like he will miss the first scrimmage game, whatever you want to call it, of preseason. And that like limits guys' ability to adapt. Like we saw that with Jay Davila last year, where he came in later in the game, later, when the team was already playing, and it took him some time to adapt. He seemed a little bit lost with the system and the everything around him in the first couple of games, had a couple rough adages, and then found his footing.
Yeah, I mean, I do think slightly different I'd worry more about that for Dithejane, right? He's obviously playing at TS Galaxy. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. Like, Mbowazi, right, coming from AFCON, he's playing at a very high level. Versus you look at Jay Davila and kind of where he was coming from Portugal, right? But previous to that in Ivory Coast, he's not kind of used to playing with grown men at such a high level. His highest level was second league, or second team for Porto. So I worry less about that for Mbowazi, but even then, I almost think give this kid a month and a half, 2 months to start the season where he's not expected to perform, and I think that's going to be better for him long term regardless.
Yeah, I think one of the differences, I think Dithejane, right, like as a right winger especially, I suspect he will also see some time in a wingback role, just because sometimes that can be a little bit of a simpler job when you're adapting to things of, like, you're doing more vertical running, you're not having to time, make the decision about when or not to go tuck inside a little bit more. We've seen that with a lot of players, actually, ironically, including Kellyn Acosta, which Alex would tell us if he was here early in his career playing as a left back for a bit. But center backs, like that's a position where communication is key. And I think that Mbowazi was brought in to step into a starting role fairly quickly if he's able to. And I think versus Dithejane, on the right wing, like it's, Philip Zinkernagel played a lot of minutes last year, and he could probably, use some additional time, resting, especially with the Fire being in an additional competition this year. But the more time you've got to adapt, especially when there's like language issues, and also just, communicating with your center back pairs and the other people on the wing, in the case of, Dithejane, the, other midfielders, the center forward, it makes it, the preseason's valuable, right? And that just makes it a little bit harder for a guy to step in and make a contribution week 1, week 2 of the season.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, the nice thing is, you don't have a tremendous need for depth at all those positions, right? You have kind of both fullback roles covered comfortably. You have some winger depth, especially adding Chris Mueller back to the mix. Not ideal necessarily, but good enough. With that, just a quick hit on some of the roster situation currently. Fire now have 13 of their 8 allowed international roster slots and 5 of their allowed 4 U22 players. Tim got an article up this week kind of breaking down how that can be worked around. Would recommend going and reading that. It's on menandred97.com. Tim, if you want to give us a quick hit on the high points and the low points of what this looks like.
So the U22s are basically a non-issue. When Viktor Radojevich was brought in, the Fire gave him a U22 designation. It's purely a cap move. He did not come on an exorbitant transfer fee. He's not earning an absolute ton of money. So by moving him off the U22 slot, which is the move I expect the Fire to make, they just basically would pay him, and his cap hit would be the same as any other player. What that effectively does is it means that some of that transfer fee and some of his wages on the contract, even though he didn't appear last season, will never hit the Fire's cap effectively. So that's smart cap management. So U22 is not an issue. International slots, I mean, obviously, teams can trade for them. I kind of like walk through the possibilities here in my roster thing. Trading for 5 is a lot, especially this time of year when the value is highest. So I expect that what the Fire are going to do is a combination of the moves available. They've been able to get guys green cards relatively quickly. That means they don't require one. I expect that that'll happen with 1 or 2 players. I expect that the team will trade for a slot or 2. And I wouldn't be 100% surprised. Greg has indicated there could be 1 more move in, although that's not guaranteed. And with the roster being completely full right now, that means 1 move out. And just given the value of international slots, and especially there being some guys that maybe are not getting the minutes that you would hope they would get professionally at this stage in their career, like Amari Glasgow, I think that it's possible they'll go on loan. It's possible they'll be sold elsewhere. Marin Haile Selassie is the other name that I think would be obvious in that list, just because he's, like I said, like kind of too good of a player to be, playing limited minutes off the bench all the time.
100%. Wonderful. Last little bit we'll hit here. Just going to mention it from interesting from a former Fire and USMNT player. Brian Gutierrez officially called up to the Mexican national team, called up to El Tri, following that debut with Chivas where he had an assist and a man of the match. And this is, okay, good. I asked him the question and he just filled it in. Perfect. It does not require a one-time switch because the 2 call-ups he had with the men's national team was not an official competition. So, look, this is not a United States men's national team podcast, but I have been very critical of the way Poch has handled his dual nats, and this feels like another one kind of slipping away. But that's life, I suppose.
The asterisk to all of that, of course, is that he could go in camp. He could even play in the friendlies for El Tri and then show up back in the U.S. men's national team camp. I mean, look, I think for a player like, Brian, he told Alex that he thought of his position as being settled with the U.S. men's national team. Now, that was last summer, not that long ago, but a lot can change in not that long of a time. He was also saying that when the coach that was probably going to read the interview was a former U.S. men's national team head coach, so like that may have been a little bit of the factor. But he came up through the U.S. youth national team. I mean, that's not guarantees of anything. We've seen guys do that and then play for other countries. I think in the end, though, look, if one team is offering him an opportunity to play in a World Cup, especially this cycle, he's going to take it. That's just not likely to be the U.S. men's national team in 2026, just with the pool. Depending on what he's hearing from El Tri, if that is a possibility of, even a somewhat long shot, I mean, that's a very compelling thing that I think any player would think long and hard about before saying no to.
I mean, I just to kind of add some context here too, Poch called in like 77 players over the last year. That Guti wasn't one of them is probably driving some of this decision making, right? Like I think he cast a pretty wide net and it included a lot of MLS. And if you're just not seeing that, then maybe it's a mismanagement of dual nationals, but maybe Poch just doesn't rate him and that this is a better opportunity for him to play.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing to me specifically on that, Drew, is like that is, I assume that's what it is, right? It's purely, he's like, this guy can't contribute in 26. I'm here for 26. From that aspect, I do get it, right? I don't know how you can, and maybe I'll be alone in this, I don't know how you can look at like Diego Luna and say there's that stark of a difference. That Diego Luna will start important games with like real players around him, and Brian Gutierrez doesn't even get a call, right? That to me is kind of the confusion, because I'm not saying Brian Gutierrez should be starting or even going to the World Cup in 2026. I also don't know that Diego Luna should make that list either, if we're being like totally honest.
He may not in the end, to be completely honest. Yeah. I think this is where it comes into Pochettino's how he evaluates players, and this is part of the limitations of him probably only being here for the World Cup. Like, he's only focused on that 26 World Cup and not necessarily the 2030 World Cup. So his goals are very specific. And Poch is also notably a vibes guy. Vibes are important to him. They're very important to him. And I will say, comparatively, like from a technical skill level, I totally agree with you. Luna, Gutierrez, I don't think that there's a massive difference between the two of them. From a vibes perspective, I think there is. And I think that that's probably where that plays in.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way. I mean, having seen, Guti in training, seeing some of the stuff that he can do, watching him closely, I really think that on a technical level, he has the capability to be a much better player than Diego Luna. I think Luna is much closer to his ceiling than what we've seen Brian Gutierrez get. But I think that at right now, Guti there's not a lot of highlight reels of him and something he does on the pitch changing a game. And you can see there's a lot of tape on Luna doing that. And I think that is a difference. I think the other thing that we've heard, just, anyone that covers the national team, I think, talking to people that do closely and just talking to some players that you'd think maybe would be in communication, something that most national team head coaches will do, or someone on the staff, maybe one of the assistants will do, is just be in touch with guys that are in the pool and explain things of like, hey, we saw this. It's really good that you're doing that. Like, one thing we want you to work on is this, or, you should talk to your coach about like maybe getting that part of your game more complete. Like, that's sort of what happened with what we saw from Brady, like trying to work on his ball handling skills and stuff like that a little bit. And I think that that's been responsible for him finally getting some attention from the national team. But Poch's camp have not been doing that. They have not been calling guys. They have not been telling guys why they were called up, why they weren't called up. There haven't been discussions of, here's what we want to see from you. And like, that hand-holding can make a huge difference. And, especially, John, to your point with dual nationals, because if someone is talking to you and giving you advice and helping you out, and sometimes maybe like that's one of the things national teams can do, right? Of like, if things are not going great and there's some issue with your club or you hit a roadblock, you've got somebody else that can kind of be cheerleading you, giving advice, pep talking, and giving, really solid coaching sometimes. And it's an escape. And that's not really something that's been happening as much with Poch. It's been, he runs the camps that he runs. He's there when there are the games, but it's not a lot of, hey, I saw your game last Saturday. I thought it was really good that you were able to show us this. Like, congrats on what you're doing with your club now, right?
In fact, he's been sort of outwardly against doing that. Like, when people have asked him about that, he's like, no, we want them to come. We want them to figure out how to get to the club, get to the national team level, right? I'm not worried about giving them information in between. I mean, he's been overt in that manner. Reasonable people can disagree about the philosophy there, but that is, I think, leads to the point that you're making, Tim.
And I think says something a little bit about the culture of football that Poch has come from, and sort of what he understands the role of a national team being, right? Like, you don't have to handhold guys to make it to the Argentinian national team level so they can put together a competitive squad. Not that he's coached that team, but like, that's, his nation of origin. Like, that's what he's most experienced with, just seeing from growing up and everything else. You don't have to try to like tell guys, hey, like, someday you'll make it to the big leagues when you're coaching Tottenham, right? I mean,
yeah. No, well put. Well put. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I've just been frustrated with Poch's handling of some of this. You see the clips of Brian Gutierrez, Obed Vargas, Richie Ledesma, like all these guys who were in the U.S. youth national team setup, and now you're missing them. And look, like I said, 26, probably not the biggest thing, but you're thinking about what 2030 and maybe even 2034 look like. It's like, well, there goes your guys who are going to be in their prime during those years.
So, John, what you're saying
I do think it's somewhat... Go ahead, Tim.
No, go ahead, Drew.
I do think it's somewhat noteworthy that we're seeing this level of Mexican passport holding youth player coming from mostly MLS academies right now. Like, yeah, absolutely. It's kind of an interesting shift that we're seeing, that MLS academies are starting to provide Mexican national teamers and Liga MX players really from their academy.
And I think that's, the Mexican youth development pipeline has been, I think, really damaged by some of the culture around some of those clubs of the demand to win right then. It's harder to do long-term strategic planning. There, like, the lack of investment. There's a few clubs that still do try to develop talent, kind of to sell it on sometimes to some of the bigger clubs like Chivas or like Club America, Cruz Azul, Monterrey. Like, you can go down the list. But a lot of those teams are not really prioritizing youth development themselves. Even the ones that have enough resources, where it's like, you could just spend marginally less on the next guy that you're bringing in to be the third in the depth chart at your like, defensive midfielder role. And that would be real money you could spend on the academy developing players, and they're not doing it. But, look, if the U.S. don't perform at the 2026 World Cup, John, I think that what you're missing here is the big picture, which it opens an opportunity for the Fire to win the World Cup.
Is Schweinsteiger going to coach that team, or how's that going to work?
I believe he may be the mascot. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Whoever the next when we finally have our unveiling ceremony with Puso and Mboaze, the question can be, how are you going to help the United States win the World Cup? Like, how do you get this team there?
I forgot that happened again with Sonny. Oh man.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on here. Let's kind of talk about the reason we brought Drew in, and that is as we mentioned, first preseason matchup for the Fire will be day of release Monday, January 19th against Fortaleza, but this coming Saturday they'll get their first test against MLS competition, that being friendly against Sporting Kansas City down in the great state of Florida.
Whoa, John, we're not just like letting you just drop that. Okay, look, I know you've got Florida connections. It's still.
I'm just trying to be polite, Tim, okay? I don't want to be rude to anybody. There's a lot of, how you say, hostility in the national conversation at the moment, so why don't we all just be a little more polite, maybe? I don't know. Anyway.
Do you guys have a noteworthy listenership in Florida right now? I'm not aware of.
My mom? Yeah. Actually, no, she's moving back here, so never mind.
Just DJ fending off gators and listening to the pod when he's not recording with us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, shout out DJ. No, so look, a lot of I don't want to say turbulence, but we'll say turnover at Sporting Kansas City for the first time in what feels like ever. Peter Vermees out as head coach and chief soccer decision maker. David Lee being brought in from NYCFC, and of course, old friend Rafa Wicki now being tapped to lead the first team. Drew, I want to give you the floor a little bit to maybe paint a picture for our listeners in terms of for lack of a better word, the vibes in Kansas City at the moment.
I mean, cautious optimism, I guess, is probably the best way of describing it. The problem, I guess we'll start with just kind of the current state of things, where you had a person, there's just an outsized character in Peter Vermees as the overseer of literally everything, and sort of synonymous with the club, especially post rebrand. They announced, when they announced Rafa Wicki, they said he's the fifth coach in Sporting Kansas City history. He's actually the second coach in Sporting Kansas City history. He's the fifth coach in franchise history. Like, Peter Vermees is the only coach. He took over when they were the Wizards. They went through the rebrand, and from what a lot of people know of this franchise, he has literally been the only guy there. So it is a sort of noteworthy change. You're also talking about a guy who had his fingers in literally everything as the chief soccer officer and the head coach. And I know you guys have that in Berhalter right now, but I think the structure is completely different than what it was under Vermees, where Vermees really had control and wanted to maintain control over a lot of pieces of how the club operated. And decoupling all of that has sort of torn the house down to the studs, so to speak, and both from a roster perspective as well as from a staffing perspective. And so there's a very thin front office right now. There's obviously a very thin roster right now. So there's just a lot of building that has to happen. And I think it's good and it needed to happen. And the club is in probably a better place long term by building together a more familiar competitive structure within the technical staff. But it's going to take some time, and in the meantime, things might be a little bit bumpy, and I think that's what we're kind of going through right now, at least what the club is going through right now.
So that's actually a good point that I hadn't actually it wasn't on my list of things to talk about, but building out the front office is something that happens. I mean, that was my big question with Greg coming in, right? Is the counter argument was sort of Peter Vermees, where even as the league had grown and become more complex, and there started just being more to the work, right? Of like, you're now actually managing a second professional football team in MLS Next Pro, unless you're like DC or Montreal. And despite all of that, it seemed like he was the guy. Like, everything ran through him, and then he had to get ready to, get guys playing a game on Saturday. And like, that just is not work that any one human being can do, especially not well. And my question was that going to be the situation in Chicago, or were there going to be enough sort of like trusted lieutenants around to spread the work and make it so that like Greg could be involved in the decisions and maybe even the decision maker for most things, but not the only person doing a lot of the work. And I think by this time last year, the Fire had already announced that Greg Broughton had come in as sporting director, and like I think that he had shown an interest in MLS. He certainly was aware of the league, and knew more about MLS, I think, than most people with that background in England and Europe would have had. So he was a guy that wouldn't have been a crazy name for a like chief soccer officer in MLS, and he's kind of in as the number two. On top of that, there's a strategy person, there's a head of recruitment, there's a separate general manager that handles a lot of the work that I think people don't realize the sporting director's office still has to do, day to day. And as far as I know, David Lee hasn't really done that to nearly the same extent yet.
He hasn't really been able to be completely candid, Tim. And I think that's part of the problem, right? It's just the timeline upon which all this had to happen, and the extremely unsurmountable kind of pile of work that needs to be completed. They're just sort of chipping away at it. I think that's kind of what's happening here. So Lee was hired right at the end of the regular season. That was when he was announced, and he was pretty open in his press conference, saying my first goal is hiring a coach. I have to get a coach hired. And he's like, yes, we need players, yes, we need to do all of these other things, but I need to get a coach hired. And he is a very programmatic executive. Like, that is kind of his style. He has a process by which he identifies and then goes through the process of deciding which coach he wants or which player he wants. And he went through that program, and it took 3 months. And so now we get to December, and Rafa Wicki is announced as the head coach, which great, they hired a coach, whatever. He hasn't been able to do. I mean, I'm not saying he's not working on those things, but it's not his primary focus. His primary focus is the first team right now.
And I think that's a little interesting because, like, in theory, right, like that number two person could be helping you with those things. And I mean, if you think about what the difference in workload is between the front office and the coach, because those are now separate in KC, which is the model that basically every club, Chicago being, I think, the notable exception in MLS, has done around the league. And the idea is the front office sticks around and can come up with a plan that survives an individual bad season or two, or things not working out with a certain player or coach, and so that you can replace a coach and the overall strategy can still be pursued. And not having someone that's like that number two in the front office helping with that strategy, like, you'd think that person would really be able to have input and help hire that coach and make sure it's right. And now it's sort of like, hey, you want to come in and work with me and Rafa Wicki, even though I think, as something you told me, Drew, is it looks like he will not be very involved in the squad. I mean, Rafa Wicki will not be very involved in the squad build in KC.
That's not the vibe that I'm getting. No, I think you don't. Well, first of all, you don't go through the time and effort and financial investment to bring David Lee from NYCFC on a 7-year deal in order to then not give him the keys and make him in charge of what's happening, right? Like, I think they give him the president and the GM role and whatnot. Like, there's obviously some salary and there's a variety of things that were provided there to bring David Lee into this role. He's in charge of what's going to happen. He identified a coach that had similar ideas of what the on-field product he wanted to see were, and then the rest is just coaching the guys I give you. And I that is the vibe that I'm getting from within the club. I think
does that make it all the more odd that they haven't really made any moves roster-wise?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like, it's one thing if you want to work in collaboration with the coach, but if this is, hey man, you're getting what I give you, it does feel like you're shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. Maybe intentionally?
It's I think it again goes to, one, a very programmatic philosophy towards player identification and acquisition, along with the fact that, again, I don't know how fine a point I can put on this. They have 3 front office staff right now. They have David Lee, they have Mike Burns, they have Jacob Peterson, who is meant to be, you guys may remember Jake from when he was a MLS player. He was meant to be their domestic scout. So he was hired to be scouting USL and other MLS teams and MLS Next Pro. That was what he was brought on to do. Their scouting director left in the middle of last year. And so, like, they literally have 3 front office full-time staff. Now, they've contracted a lot of stuff since then. So what Lee has done in the short term, he's contracted an analytics data provider. He's contracted, they've contract scouts as well as intermediaries they're working with to kind of do some of the negotiations with a lot of these clubs. But the feeling I get is that they're not really in a good place from the scouting information that they have. So if you consider Lee coming in 3.5 months ago, not having a really complete built out scouting network or scouting information, and then having to kind of go through and do all of that while hiring a coach, you can see why we're at this point where they haven't brought much over the line.
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
I think that gets back to like the point of having others around you, right? Of one of the things that I think Greg Broughton brought with him when he came to Chicago was his Rolodex, right? Like he had been in roles where he was scouting players, he had signed players from a number of different places in Europe and around the world. He had, and just a lot of connections from an entire career, right? Of football in a different continent or on a different continent, and that means that there's like hey, we were looking at this guy at one point, we can check in on him. I've criticized the way that the Fire treat the draft because I think that they're right in thinking it's not going to be a way to get a lot of good players year in, year out. But I still think that every year you see a couple of guys break through from the draft that become high quality MLSers and sometimes sold on for millions of dollars, and it's like you ignore that you're at your own peril. The Fire's draft, like the Fire's college level scouting has largely been contracted for the past few years rather than being a full-time guy that's working for you that you get to communicate with. And I think that really shows up in the quality of the product that you get out of their scouting, right? Because they could be sending almost exactly the same report to somebody else. And they're like, I like this guy, but I'm not sure that I like this guy for Kansas City, so I'm not going to talk about him. So I'll, send this name to one of my other clients, but I think this guy could be okay for you guys. Like you don't necessarily get everything you want, and it's the same thing with the data and analytics of, a lot of this data is nuanced, especially when you're trying to determine both like internal and external performance, and not being able to have those conversations and build those models yourself, I think can hurt your ability to get a good view of it.
Can I toss kind of a two-pronged thought at you, Drew? On David Lee coming from NYCFC, right, City Football Group, is there any kind of to what Tim's talking about here with this idea of kind of farming out the analytics and a lot of the recruiting and maybe even some of the negotiating? Like, is there any concern that City Football Group is such a different ecosystem, right, just in terms of their reach, in terms of their global ability of what they can do, that maybe this guy is a great mind, and I don't mean to say he can't do his job because, we don't know, and we'll see. Is there any concern of, how is this going to translate to a truly independent operation? And then also, B, the thing we haven't talked about in all this is it was just announced that there's a new controlling partner for Sporting Kansas City, Peter Malik. I may be saying that wrong.
It's Maluk, but yeah, you're good.
Maluk.
No worries.
I wanted to say Maluk, but I thought that would sound worse if I was wrong about it. Peter Maluk, not the sole owner, but the new majority owner. A valuation of $700 million, which was, I feel like, high, more than what I expected, to be honest. But if that is the case, then it's just good news there. Anywho, I say all that to say, he was speaking with the Kansas City Star and said what you're going to see next season is a big, big financial commitment. And that to me almost kind of feels like, are we punting a little bit on 2026?
Well, and I don't know specifically. First of all, just to take that comment, I don't know specifically that he meant 2027. I think he means this. I think he means 2026.
Okay, yeah. Maybe it's
that just maybe just some turn of phrase situation. I don't know for sure. I haven't spoken to him about it, but that's the feeling that I got from the comment. Going back to the first part of this question, David Lee. These are real questions that have been asked since he was hired. Can he operate outside the City Football Group structure and umbrella? Does he have the contacts? Does he have the ability to build this on his own? Or was he successful mainly because he had all of that at his disposal? I mean, we're going to have to wait and see, unfortunately. I mean, I think that the fact that he was be able to continually create success with that team in that larger structure is a testament to his ability to work within it to find the ability to be successful. That said, he's never had to build these structures out on his own. I do believe that is what sort of drew him to this project, is it could be his own thing. It didn't. He was no longer sort of
a
required
cog in that giant football empire, right?
Yeah.
He gets his shot.
And there are multiple stories that have come out since then about players that he tried to sign or players that he did sign that he had to go fight with the CFG board to be allowed to sign, because they very specifically wanted him following a very sort of defined player acquisition philosophy, both on age and profile. And he had to kind of push beyond that in several circumstances to make the team good. So I do believe that there are going to be some benefits to him in this circumstance. It's just really the problem is, and we've said this on Home and Away a few times, really the problem is, the biggest issue of this whole process was when Sporting went on that run in 2023, made the playoffs, beat St. Louis in the first round. That totally set this whole process back by like 2 years, because there were Fire Vermes chants in the stands in May of 2023. And he got very upset about it, like actually combative with the fans about it. There's the whole story about them going out to the Illigs ranch and like tearing it down, and that sort of built this camaraderie, and they went on this run, blah, 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 right? And that has been discussed on side and a variety of other places. The reality of that is that Vermes was given another 2 or year and a half, basically, to try to fix it on his own, when there was not the structure in place for him to be able to accomplish that effectively. And so when he finally leaves, there's very little left behind. You're almost building an expansion team. And that is what Lee is trying to have to do in real time. And I think 18 months from now, you're going to see a fairly significant structure that looks like what Chicago has in place now. But it's going to take him some time to accomplish that. When it comes to Maluk, what I can say is this. Maluk's been on the ownership group since late 2021, early 2022 is when he bought a minority stake in the club. And he has been a vocal owner in the last couple years. For people who aren't, for you guys probably not super tied into the news around Sporting Kansas City, but there has been conversation about, Vermes going on. Vermes in 2024 went on a public, he did interviews over and over talking about how I don't have a discretionary budget and I have to ask every time I want to sign a player, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There were meetings that happened with Vermes after that with the ownership group where he was given a discretionary budget. I have on fairly good authority that Peter Maluk was a driving force behind getting that discretionary budget put in place. This is an aggressive owner that does want to make this team better. And I do believe with him as the majority owner of the club, you are going to see that financial investment. I also will tell you, this is a transaction that's been brewing for a long time. This is something, you don't make it at the $700 million valuation. We can discuss whether that's good or not separately, but you don't make an investment at a $700 million valuation, effectively buy out the Illig family without it taking some time and also sort of looking under the covers as far as what is going on here and what is needed for them to be successful. So you can be certain that David Lee certainly had Peter Maluk sign off. You can be certain that he participated in the conversation regarding firing Peter Vermes. And you can be certain that the investments that David Lee was promised when he was hired were very much driven by this transaction.
I think there is a similar comparison of, it was like 50% and the rest just a year later, but with Joe Mansueto buying the Fire, if he owned half of it, and then it was there's an option for the second part, we don't really know. Not a ton changed visibly during that year that he owned part of it. And then after he bought the rest of the club, I mean, it basically in an offseason, everything changed. Not 100% of it for the better, and we can talk about Georg Heitz's tenure. We've done that a lot on this podcast already. But I think that's something that was frustrating for Fire fans was there was a new willingness almost instantly to spend more money on the squad. I think it took a while for some fans to kind of recognize that because there was such an ingrained belief that we're not a team that spends in the back of their minds. But suddenly the Fire were spending that money and performance didn't improve. And I think that something that was frustrating to a lot of fans was not seeing that kind of visible change, especially in performance on the field. for so many years. Really, like 2025 was the first year that it felt tangibly better than 2019 by a lot of metrics. And I think that is, kind of a challenge. Although one thing, just to get back to the, squad build pretty concretely, I mean, something that David Lee kind of inherited that, Georg Heitz didn't in 2019, 2020 was a team that had two DPs that are more or less set in stone on the roster, right? And Dejan Joveljic and Manu Garcia. And I'm not 100% sure how you rate them in the kind of like hierarchy of people that could be in that role around the league. But like, I think that, especially, Joveljic is a high quality player. I don't know that he's yet shown that he's in the conversation of like top, 3, 4, 5 names, maybe top 5, but like I don't think I'd put him much higher than that, playing in like that role in the league. And like that kind of constrains what changes you can make. You can't just go in, well, except for going 3-3, which the team could do because they don't have any U22s now. But there's only one big splash that you can make with a large signing, and I don't know if that is maybe constraining things, but at the same time, sometimes you just need to sign some guys.
I mean, Joveljic was probably the only bright spot of significance on the roster for the club last year, a team that was pretty bad and almost competing for the spoon. I think they tied on points for the spoon, to be completely honest, or one above it. So we're talking about not a very good team last year. Joveljic went for 18-2. Like, he had a very good season. And so that was the one sort of bright spot of all of this. Mike Burns actually swooping in and getting him from the Galaxy for like a $4 million cash was a big deal. This is a guy who scored goals regularly in MLS. Is he an MVP candidate? That's a separate conversation, right? I do understand where you're coming from, Tim. Like, if you look at the elite DPs in the league and the ones that teams spend $15-20 million transfer fees for, is he in that category? I'm not sure. I think for classic Sporting Kansas City, who, that was run by Peter Vermees for the last 17 years, Joveljic and Manu Garcia are great DPs because, previous to that, it's Alan Pulido, right? And it's Gadi Kinda, RIP. It's a number of players like that Felipe Gutierrez, right? These are not guys that you're going, oh my God. I mean, Felipe Gutierrez had a great 2018 season. He got injured in 2019, and that team was close to getting to MLS Cup in 2018. So they've been able to build a good squad around DPs in the past, but you're right. These aren't Carlos Vela. These aren't Evander. These aren't Lionel Messi. They aren't of that category. And so it is interesting to see long term with Maluk in charge. Do they start making swings like that?
Because he's,
I think
because Joveljic is under contract through the middle of next year.
No, he's through the end of 27.
Right? So, yeah, so like that's what I'm saying. It's like this season, the sprint season, and then half of the next season, which is just awkward for everybody. But like that's not something that you really want to move quick. I mean, I think that he's in a lot of ways a fantastic value signing, right? Like he's put up arguably better numbers than Hugo Kuipers did. I think I'd be more comfortable seeing him play on the wing than I would Hugo Kuipers, which I think would just not really work. And so putting up similar to better, like better numbers realistically, like I think overall similar level of player and stuff at like a third of the acquisition cost is, I mean,
it's good business, right?
Yeah.
I mean, from an analytical perspective, if you're trying to be the Brentford of MLS, this is a great signing, right? And I think that is kind of the world that Kansas City has operated in this that is the world they've operated in this league. Whether they start to try to elevate that will be an interesting thing. I think in the short term, Tim, your point is valid. With Manu Garcia, with Joveljic, they have their two DPs, certainly for 2026. If things don't work out for whatever reason in 2026 and David Lee's looking at it and going, I've got an opportunity to really shake this roster up, maybe they do. But for this year, I actually think having those two solidified sort of simplifies the process a little bit as far as what they're trying to accomplish in 2026, which is build out the middle of the roster, which is why Lee has been so overt about the fact that they are going to stay 2-4 because he wants the additional GAM to really build out the middle of the roster.
Yeah, and actually that makes me wonder, like, if they go just really quickly, John, sorry to interrupt. I mean, it just seems like Ruben Lode would have been such a good guy for them to target, if he was available, because being able to play in
Yeah.
multiple midfield roles, MLS experience, very, very high level, arguably as good as some guys that have the DP tag at that role in the league, could play as the 10 if maybe you think, Manu Garcia is not going to be sticking around forever, can play deeper in the midfield, can play, a little bit on the wing. I'm not sure you want to rely on that too much going forward just as he ages, but it just seems like a guy that really could provide so much to an MLS roster if you're trying to rebuild.
I think you're right, but I think it's also shows a completely what we've seen from Lee so far is he wants the team to get quite a bit younger. And so he's really focusing on younger signings. And Lud is obviously, if you're signing him, you're signing him. Now, I think the Fire did a 1+1 with him, which would be ideal, I think, for that kind of signing for Sporting. But I do think you're seeing philosophically where Lee is focused, at least so far, is more on uprising players that he can then transfer maybe in the future for a profit. I think there is some thought to that as far as how they're looking at identification.
Yeah. And Lotus
was
under contract through the end of the 2027-2028 season. Yeah. So the half season plus another one. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And that was kind of a lot of the conversation we had last year about kind of the Fire and roster building and all the talks of Neymar and De Bruyne and whomever else, right? It was, I think, Tim, you and I were both starched strongly on the side of not signing those names just to sign names. And I think maybe I fell a little more on the side of stick with that 2-4-2, take your extra gam, get another young guy in who will grow with the squad and kind of develop. And, maybe he gets sold on, maybe he becomes a long-term piece for this team. And I think that seems to maybe be a little bit of the mindset. And I think the place where I think we can leave this and kind of move on to our next thought. But in that same interview with Kansas City Star, Peter Maluk, when asked why now to purchase a controlling interest, his immediate response was because the option presented itself. And that, to me, if you're somebody who, I think like all three of us probably wants MLS as a whole to grow and improve and get better, those are the kind of owners you need, right? This is a guy who's got $11 billion, and he wants to own the Sporting Kansas City and make them successful in a similar way to what we've seen with Joe Mansueto, right? He wants them to be great.
To add on to that, he's a minority owner of the Royals. And there's a lot of not fun stuff happen over the last year with the Royals trying to get a downtown stadium, it going to a vote, and then it getting piggybacked with Arrowhead, and I'm not even going to get into all that. But John Sherman started shopping the club at that point. And I will tell you that he had an opportunity to do that if he wanted to. And he chose Sporting Kansas City instead.
Which is crazy, right? Because, I mean, he's been a Royals fan like most of his life. Like, he, didn't he used to work as like a bat boy with a club or something like that when he was?
Yeah, he was like a clubhouse attendant as a teenager, and didn't realize that he had chosen the opponent clubhouse, so he wasn't actually in the Royals clubhouse, and had to used to like drive those guys to the hotel across the street late at night after drinking in the clubhouse and whatnot. Anyway, there's some great stories about that. Yeah, he is still a minority owner of the Royals and will continue to be, and he goes to Royals games regularly. But I do think like I feel fairly positive that he had the opportunity, if he wanted to have taken over the Royals. And the fact that he decided to take over Sporting Kansas City, I do think is noteworthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I say all that, and then looking into 2027 and beyond, when the Fire and Sporting Kansas City will be back in the same division as opposed to in separate conferences. Don't love it as much, actually. Would prefer if they played a little less. But if nothing else, a rising tide lifts all boats.
To talk about just for a minute, like I know we're kind of going a little long here. We may not get to everything, but it's sort of crazy the way that this offseason, what we think of the, I guess, hierarchy of the future Midwest division, whatever it's called, the best division. I don't know. We can just throw names out there. It has sort of shaken up a little bit, right? Where it looks like we're seeing Minnesota United sort of like take a step back and not really willing to take a step forward again, of like taking more of a, we're going to be a small market club. We have a budget. Here's how we operate kind of philosophy. And SKC looking poised to, we haven't seen the actual movement from it yet, but like looks like they've got a lot of ammunition to start, making a big impact all of a sudden. Whereas I think it wasn't that long ago, you sort of look at where things are and like you would have had the Fire at the sort of like bottom of the division before 2025. I think now they've pushed up. Looks like Columbus has taken a step back. It looks like FC Cincinnati are maintaining, but like, what's the next step? Is there a next trick? And like, suddenly SKC may be pushing its way significantly up that hierarchy. It could be a very competitive division.
I totally agree, and I think that I'm excited for it. To be completely honest, I know that there's a lot of wringing of hands of the schedule and the division setup and single table, et cetera, et cetera. The thing that this league has struggled with for a while is developing consistent rivalries. It just really has.
No, every team's had a rivalry week where it's like, oh, cool, we're playing that club we played twice in the past.
And it
years.
existed between Sporting and the Fire back in the early 2010s, but that was only related to us playing regularly, right? Like there were games between us regularly. Once that went away, that rivalry went away.
Yep.
Kansas City and St. Louis will always be a rivalry because of Kansas City and St. Louis, from the regional aspect of those two cities just having sort of this brotherly fight all the time. Like it's just kind of how they are. But having consistent games against teams in a similar region, I do think it helps. It helps a lot.
Yeah, because you can have fans travel. Like it's the same thing with Chicago and St. Louis, largely, because of the baseball history there, and then being just like a few hours by train or driving. If it's an afternoon game, it can be a day trip. I mean, and not in the broader Midwest sense of like it's only 8 hours away. I can make it a day trip whenever it is.
Right.
And I think that that's huge, right? Like familiarity breeds contempt. I think that the Fire taking the first couple games, winning in the Open Cup, St. Louis getting one back, and then that makes it more of a rivalry a little bit. And I think seeing more of that, getting more familiar, like having some history, really can do a lot to make fans sort of feel energized about something. And also just, look, it's amazing that when Miami is playing in Portland or whatever, I don't think this actually happened since Messi's been there, but like there will be a small contingent of people traveling across a continent, and they're like shoved up in like the 200 level deck in one corner, supporting the away team. Like that's impressive. Like people like talking about the culture here, like that just shows how strong some people's feelings are. But it's a lot easier when you can get busloads full of people and make it a day trip. And it just changes the intensity of having a solid contingent of away fans at a game.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I love it. I love when away matches I'm too old to be going on road runs every weekend, but the Cauldron away trips, they call them the road run, like that was a big deal in the early 2010s. Going to Colorado, going to Chicago, going to these away matches was something that built a level of, first of all, camaraderie and interest in the team that I think is the passion that is necessary for all of the things that MLS wants this league to be. But additionally, it's just it makes it fun. Like this game is supposed to be fun. We're going to watch these games. We're supposed to enjoy them, and having that competitive edge is what really makes it entertaining.
Yeah, fully agree.
Well said. And look, maybe the last thing I'll say on this, I feel maybe a little spoiled because of what we've seen in the last month between the Bears and Packers. I really want to hate someone. And there's not like a team in MLS, I think, for the Fire specifically right now, that you really look at and you're like, I want the worst things possible to happen to you at every single turn. And I think my hope is that that's what the divisions breed. Having like the conferences are too big for conference play to really matter. Moving to a smaller format with the divisions, I know it won't affect playoffs too much, but having some of that like actual, these games matter a little more than the rest, I hope breeds a little bit, because I feel like that's what we're beating around the bush of here. Like, there's not a lot of teams in MLS that hate each other, and we need more of that if it's gonna.
And it's typically regional rivals, right? And like it would still be the same thing going to a more regional division setup. But I think that making it, but actually that gets to one of my questions about this format, which is like, does it go far enough? Because the only thing winning your division gets you, or division placement, is the winner of the division makes the playoffs. Which, I mean, like realistically, is going to be happening anyways. It'd be almost unfathomable that a team would make it to the postseason by winning their division, but wouldn't make it in the overall table. And so playing home and away, you're seeing more games against these teams. But in the end, if it's just, one table for the entire league, there's not a lot of extra incentive. There's not a lot of like, hey, if we beat this team, it's been not the season we wanted, but we can grab the number 2 spot in the division, and like that gets us a wild card spot, or like whatever it is, like whatever the format is, or like the number 3 spot, like however you do it. And I am a little maybe concerned about like that, one table format where you're playing a lot of teams, and results that are outside of your control can sort of affect where you land. Like we saw that with the Leagues Cup format changing last year, right? Of like, if you had one bad game, your first game, you maybe even just ended with a draw and you lost in the shootout, there was no point for the next 2 games because of the way the tables were organized. This is a little different, but it's also the teams that are in front of you on the schedule are not necessarily the teams you're fighting with in the standings. And I think that limits some of that ability to develop that important, big game, heated rivalry thing.
I understand what you're saying, but I also think and it may be true. You may be right, Tim, but I think you're also discounting how much American sports fans love a standings list. Let me tell you, when you open that divisional standings, I'm telling you, like, if I'm a Sporting Kansas City fan and I open those divisional standings and the Fire and St. Louis are in front of me, I'm about to play the Fire in 2 weeks, I'm like, yeah, that game means something.
See, and that's
I do think it will mean something.
Are we even going to really see the division standings, or is it just going to be like when you go to Google
they messed
or
up
or whatever else, and it'll just be a single table? Because I think that we may just see a single table because that's the way the playoffs are going to effectively be run, and that's what sort of matters for pretty much everything, right? What you get by being in the same division is a home and away, and that's it, other than just a home or away every year.
But I think what you'll find, increased familiarity over the other teams does make a difference, right? If you're playing these guys twice a year and everybody else once, you do overtime just naturally get that more. The other thing you get is now you can be a division champion. Like, that's something, right? Like, it's in baseball, it matters a ton. In football, it matters a ton. Look at the NBA. That's where it really doesn't. They have divisions. Nobody cares because nobody celebrates winning division championships. And when that's a banner you can hang in your stadium,
I'm not sure it will be. That's the thing. I'm not. But
I'm saying like they have to make it that, and that's part of it,
right?
And that's my concern, right? Again, it's like, does the format go far enough to making the division something that, on a competitive sense, people care about? Like, fans.
It has to be branded and fed in that way. I think that's the point John's making, and I agree. Yeah. Like, I think for going far enough in this case, Tim, may just be them putting enough momentum and like effort behind making the divisions matter. The problem you have, in my opinion, like this is my long-term potential issue with this, is MLS leadership is a little bit schizophrenic when it comes to managing these structures. And 3 years from now, we're going to have a different competitive structure. That's just kind of what they do all the time. They need to be consistent over a period of time for this to work, and they have to drive the marketing and branding behind it. The NBA example is great. You know why they don't care about divisions in the NBA? Because when you pull up the table, they just show conference. That's it.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Back to this same conversation.
Like, actually, that's maybe a great way of putting the differences. If right now I Google NBA standings, it's going to give me conference. If I Google NFL, it will give me divisions. If I Google MLB, it will give me divisions. And the other thing I think I'll say, and maybe
I think the NHL is maybe the closest example, right? Of like 4 divisions. The divisions do matter. Organized into conferences. Conferences matter less. And MLS won't even have that. It has one table for every purpose except the extra game you play.
And I think the other thing that we're maybe missing the forest for the trees is like, not every big game is an important game, right? And that's something that I don't think MLS has a ton of right now. At least I'll say for the Fire, we don't have a ton of that. Look at that week 8, I'll use the NFL again because everybody knows it. Like week 18, Bears Lions meant nothing to the Lions in the grand sense of things. It actually meant nothing to either team in the grand sense of things. But the Lions won, and that's big for the fans. Like, they cared. They wanted that game. You rewind another year. Bears over the Packers. Meant nothing for either team. It was a great game. Like, that's kind of what I think is you can get if you do the divisions properly, to what Drew's saying.
And I think that, if anything, the fact that MLS has continued to change the formats, look, I don't like changing things for changing things. That actually gives me some heart here of like what we're seeing with the one, like a single table winning your division doesn't really get you anything. Being second in your division gets you absolutely nothing. That may shift over time. It may be we go to the divisions first, and then they will change the format. Maybe it becomes like that's the way the first round of the playoffs are organized, or something. Like there's just a bunch of different changes you could make down the way, like down the road, and it may just reflect that it's 30 teams, 30 owners, a lot of very different philosophies and priorities in that, and starting somewhere, you can sort of see, adapt, and then push for like longer term changes once everyone sort of acclimates to the first step.
That may be the way they iterate on it. That would be ideal in my opinion, to make small tweaks to make the structure work versus going, well, this isn't work, let's do something completely different, right? And that is my concern about
right, like tossing the old format. Like I think that there's a lot of that, right, where I think we all finally sort of adapted to the single elimination format in MLS, and like that made things fun in a certain way, like denied some fans a home playoff game, and then it's like, cool. So, you know how we said this was the best thing ever? Yeah, we're getting rid of that for one round only.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. We don't need to do that today.
100%.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, look, I think that is probably as good a place as any to wrap it, as we are pushing much longer than normal. First and foremost, again, massive thank you to Drew for joining us today, talking a little bit of Sporting Kansas City. We didn't even get to talk about Justin Reynolds. I completely forgot to talk about Justin Reynolds, your new star. Right,
he played with the starters on in the first half against FIU on Saturday. I don't know what that means. It doesn't mean anything. They have 17 rostered players at this point, so it doesn't mean much of anything.
They know exactly what he can do against teams from Miami. That's all it is. They were like, go out and get us another goal there.
I mean, look, Rafa, I think, knew his older brother had him on the squad, who's now out of the game, but I think gave him a lot of opportunities. I think Justin Reynolds is a smart pickup for SKC, and that he's certainly more high upside than he is just. You could have found a guy that was 28, 29 years old and would have been a competent, backup, wing back in the league, and that's not what they got, right? Like they got a guy that has upside that I think could get a lot of minutes in this league.
I like it better than Andrew Brody, which is what they did with that position last year. So I think from that perspective, we were making progress.
There we go. But Drew, massive thank you for being here, for joining us, talking a little bit of ball. Do you want to let people know kind of where they can find you and what to look for?
Yeah, I mean, Home and Away is the name of the podcast that we do on Sporting Kansas City. So if you're interested in what we're talking about when it comes to Sporting Kansas City, all the podcast platforms. And then I'm on Blue Sky, Drew VanDerploeg. You can find me on there, and that's usually where, if I'm on social media, that's probably the one place that I'm semi-active. And I've got all the links to the pod and our pod Discord and everything in my profile there.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't recommend enough. Not only for being a hashtag friend of the show, but for we love to support other independent MLS outfits. It's always what's that? Well, we always say the best way to grow it is to grow it together. As always, stay tuned to the website. It's meninred97.com. That's where you'll find all the latest articles, all the latest breakdowns. If you want to know how the Fire will get themselves out of the roster predicament they're currently in, or who they may be targeting to bring in at the end of this window, meninred97.com is the best place to be. It's where you'll find all the articles from Tim, from Alex, and anybody else who may be writing things that you may
John,
find interesting.
Just to give him the shout out that he wasn't going to give himself.
That is true. If you're interested in, we did have a new piece out on the potential third alternate shirt the Fire will wear this year. I thought it was pretty good. Guy who wrote it's kind of a jerk, but that's okay. The joke is it was me. Anyway, would recommend checking it out there. You can also go to any and all socials: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, really anywhere that you consume social content, we will be there. That's Men in Red 97, anywhere and everywhere that matters. And I say all that, thank you so much for being here. Shout out to our illustrious producer, Austin, for Tim, for Drew from the Home and Away pod for joining us today, and for myself, thank you so much for joining us around the bonfire. Come on, you Men in Red.